started shortly. Maybe I will say a few words about the Embrace themes. So the Embrace project is an Erasmus Plus project that is coming to a close this year. It has been, it started about 4 years ago, and we are, the leading team is Birmingham City University. The other universities involved is Vilnius University in Lithuania, the University República de Navarra from Spain, and there's also at the Western Balkans Institute in Serbia, and finally the University of Crete here in Greece and on the island of Crete. And from the University of Crete, we have put together this webinar, and the title of our webinar is Learning, Engagement, and Belonging in Higher Education. And we really are very happy that you can all join us this morning. And because we believe that the issues in higher education, the problems that have been exacerbated by the pandemic, have created basically difficulties in learning, also engagement of students, and in the feeling of belonging. And that is why we thought that this is an important issue to begin to have the webinar on. I'm going to start with basically a couple of emails that we received and that led us to thinking that this was an important topic to discuss. Okay? There was an email from a colleague that said, "I'm a professor at a big public university. This semester has been the worst ever in terms of student engagement, student performance, and failure rates. Many students frankly seem not to understand what higher education is. Those who have passed through will end up as our engineers, economists, psychologists, teachers. I cannot believe that their education will have been equivalent to those who graduated even 3 years ago. It's a crisis." And the question that arose in our minds is, what can we do about this? Then we have input from a student who said, "I graduated from a big university in 2020. And so many lecture halls were filled with hundreds of students sometimes, or at least 100 or 200 students at others, which makes it almost impossible to feel that anyone cares about your education. I think many of my fellow students in higher education view higher education as just a series of meaningless tasks that they had to go through in order to earn a glorified piece of paper before they could go out into the world. The pandemic years," the student says, "of Zoom and Teams classes have only exacerbated this feeling." So the question that arose for us is higher education just a series of meaningless tasks? And we hope that today our distinguished speakers, and with the conversation that will ensue, we could basically at least grapple with these questions and maybe come up with some ideas as to how to deal with these issues. Okay? So we will begin with Dr. Geraldine Lee-Lettrick, who is from the Birmingham City University and lead on this project, and she will tell us a few words about the Embrace project and how the issues involved in this webinar fit the project. And then we will go on and have two distinguished speakers, Dr. Stephanie Mcmahon from the University of Queensland in Australia, very far away, and she will talk about the health, a framework for supporting academic, social, and emotional engagement, connection, and well-being in higher education. And then we will have Dr. Pilar Arrazabala, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing your name, Pilar, I'm very sorry, who is from the Autonomous University of Madrid, and she's also the president of the Service Learning, the European Service Learning Initiative. And then we will have a conversation, all of us, with questions. And so please, any questions that you may have, write them down, or we most welcome the dialogue and the conversation. So Dr. Geraldine Lettrick will give us an introduction to the Embrace project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, I said I wasn't going to use overheads, Sophia, but actually I'm going to, and I'm going to share them now, if I may. I haven't got very many. I know I said I wasn't, but so I'll just share them. But they're nice, they're quite colourful, so hopefully that'll perk everybody up this morning. As Sophia explained there, and we've been working on a project since 2029 in the future, 2019, called Enabling Mental Health Benefits for Resilience, Achievement, Competencies and Engagement in Improving Higher Education Policy and Practice for Student Wellbeing. Deep breath, Embrace. There's a number of us together, been working together on this in a partnership, and there's a consortium with ourselves, with our good colleagues there in Greece, with the Universidad Pública de Navarra in Spain, the Western Balkans Institute in Belgrade, Serbia, who are an NGO, and Vilnius University as well. And so we've been working together. And this project really came out of thinking about these very problematic issues. I should put this on slideshow, shouldn't I? For you, this very problematic issues that I think we've all become aware of, even more during the pandemic, but they were always there, and they were always a problem for many of us trying to look after our students. And I think to sort of look at those drivers that pushed this project, the first one is, these kind of unprecedented wellbeing threats that really have increased over the last decades, I think, that are around, the massive employment problems that our students face, and the way that, there's a real demand that students come out with really high academic skills, but also transferable and transversal skills. And there's that pressure and the cost that students face in trying to do that. And it's a perfect storm of issues that they face. We can now add COVID into that. But that was one of the key drivers for why we decided to do the project. Also, there's our daily experience of trying to cope and cater for that. As Sophia's saying there about getting letters, really desperate letters from people who are in HE, who just feel overwhelmed by the difficulties they're facing with students, and the kind of mental health and well-being needs that students have, which are overlaid by things like debt and the work and academic overload that students face. They're trying to be students, work in a bar, work perhaps another job, and get their work in on time. We've also got a rise in Europe of hate issues within higher education, and that's globally, actually, if you look at the literature. So people facing misogyny, facing extremist kind of behaviours in the classrooms, and racisms, right from Roma communities facing racism to all kinds of other communities being abused and mistreated in the classroom sometimes, or on the campuses. And we've got this big issue of pre-existing illness as well, people attending university with problems they've already kind of got that increases the difficulties for academics, and we were aware of that. And then there's the impact, the actual impacts, the stuff we know and we see going on in our universities in relation to student quality of life and well-being. So we've got the depression, anxiety, substance misuse, interpersonal problems, and the long-term impacts, because those things don't just stop when, people become students. They have perhaps these issues that they either bring in or arise during their studies. It doesn't stop. They carry that on into their working lives, It impacts on their ability to earn. It impacts on their ability to keep and maintain jobs, and on their, their overall well-being. So these things are really, really important. And we know across Europe, for instance, Ibrahim et al. Writing, in 2012, actually pointed out that there are massively high rates of depressive illness in our student body across Europe. And they looked across Europe, all the countries of the EU, rather than the continent, the EU. And they said, there are massively high problems. Now, there are differences between countries, but overall, all of these countries have high levels of youth and student depression. So we've got a problem there. The same is true of anxiety. The Lithuanian Students' Union in 2017 did a survey of students in relation to anxiety and found that 80% of students had really quite severe criteria for anxiety. They actually demonstrated anxiety. Now that's very high, and you could say, well, the students possibly were misinterpreting it or whatever. It's not. But at the same time, it just indicates that students know something is wrong. They don't sometimes know what that thing is, but there is something wrong, and we are dealing with that as educators, but also other people across the holistic range of folk who work in HE, people in libraries, people obviously working in counselling support services, absolutely, but also people who are doing the face-to-face work, the receptionists, the catering staff. They're all dealing with things that they find really tricky, which is why our project had quite a broad remit. We wanted to look at a range of these things that hit and affect a lot of staff. We've also got the metrics that we're under, which make it important for us. It's one of our important drivers is to look at things like achievement and make sure that dropout is low as possible. Well, of course, these things are absolutely hit by if we've got students with mental health issues and well-being problems, they tend to drop out. They tend to have bigger problems. They tend to have difficulties achieving. So these things are not unconnected, and yet universities almost treat them like they are. They sort of say, we've got a problem with achievement, and over here we've got a problem with student well-being. So we felt there's a need to sort of bring those things together a bit more and overlay them rather than see them as separate. And then generally we have this wider issue of social well-being and inclusion. We know that these students today are, as pointed out by Sophia, they're the people who go into employment in the future. They're teachers, doctors, they're people who are going to be making a big impact. And if they're not well and not happy, there's going to be problems for everybody. So those are the kind of drivers we're looking at. And our project aims and objectives were really to, therefore, to kind of consolidate the good stuff that's going on and make it so it's easily implementable, because there is good stuff going on across Europe. It's just very often it's not brought together. That's quite common in many areas, as I'm sure you're all aware. And we don't really learn from the global very well either. But we were primarily focused on the European as a continent area because of the nature of the funding. We have this holistic focus, as I said, so we're interested in all the kinds of areas of university as a holistic organism working together. We wanted to provide training, tools and resources. So part of our objectives is to actually create stuff that people could use to really change their practice. And you'll see that on our website. You'll see toolkits, things that are designed to get people thinking, how can I take some of this and put it into where I am? Now, there's an issue, isn't it? Because across Europe, we have very different conditions, which is why we've got this focus that is very much about how can you interpret what we present here into your context? Because you really need somebody understanding the context to be able to inject it into the systems and structures in specific areas. But it's important for our aims and objectives. And another thing was to share and disseminate the above areas. So doing what we're doing today, speaking to you, and hopefully you'll speak to other people and speak to other people, and we'll have that snowball effect of change. So our methodology was very much, it was what we call a work package methodology, so chunks of work that were set together, usually around toolkits, but we also have a report. So we have 6 toolkits, which are sets of information that you can work through and actually think about that in relation to your own HE setting. It's not designed for any particular discipline, because of course we want to reach out to all kinds of areas. It's no good psychologists, for instance, talking to just psychologists, because really we need somebody teaching physics to know about something about health, mental health and well-being, be able to help their students. Provide case studies, you know, sort of policy strategies, really at the level of developing policies within the university, and structuring how universities can change, but also of relevance to higher level policymakers who want to think about wider change within the university sectors in their countries or regions. Webinar training, as we're doing now, and also, you know, our website. So we've got a web site that actually hosts our toolkits and is a kind of destination that you can go to think about the issues, and you can email us even from there and talk to us about things. So it's opening up that dialogue as well with folk. So we've tried to map diverse responses to student mental health. We've looked at diverse ways to build resilience. So you'll see that especially, you know, in the Greek toolkits done by the Greek team. They've really kind of done a great job of demonstrating that issue of how to build resilience, I think. We've thought about things like environmental mastery. You know, how do we help students to be masters of the environment they're in, no matter how difficult that is? You know, what can we provide? You know, things like pastoral counselling, pastoral care, personal counselling, yoga, you know, meditation type techniques, friendship network development. And also, you know, how do we share initiatives? How do we make HEI ways of doing things better by sharing this stuff? And we've really focused upon that. And then lastly, there's that issue of partnership working, bringing in all the kinds of people to help us from different sectors, so that HE doesn't work alone through these issues, because we can't really address it entirely on our own. We do need to look outside to all the kinds of resources we might be able to draw upon. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. So today, what you're going to hear is really fascinating stuff that, you know, really interweaves beautifully with what we've been doing with the Embrace project. And I hope that today is a fruitful day for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. That was a great introduction to the project. And we will now hear from Dr. Stephanie Mcmahon from the University of Queensland in Australia, and she will be presenting on the HEF framework for supporting academic, social, emotional engagement, connection, and well-being in higher education. So, Dr. Mcmahon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sophia. And I'm just going to share my screen if I could. And bring up my slides. Okay, can you see those all right?
Yes, beautifully, thank you.
Okay, good. And I'm just putting on my timer so that I try and stick to the 20 minutes because obviously there's a wonderful amount to get through tonight. And well, I'm going to say tonight, but it's your morning. But thank you very much, firstly, Sophia, for your invitation to be part of this conversation. And I think what I will bring to this conversation is perhaps a little bit different to what others might bring to it, because my background is quite different. But I'm going to share with you our higher education learning framework, which we refer to as the HELF. And it's a framework for supporting academic, social, and emotional engagement, connection, and well-being in higher education. So just to start with, just so you know where I am, I'm joining you from Brisbane, which is in the state of Queensland on the east coast of Australia, a beautiful part of the world, but a very, very long way from you. And in particular, I'm joining you from the University of Queensland, which is our premier university in this state. And as I always do, I firstly would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am joining you from today, which are the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, the Indigenous owners of this land, who have ensured the well-being of our land and waterways here in this beautiful part of the world. So just to provide a little bit of context and a little bit of background to myself and my team. So I'm a lecturer in the School of Education here at the University of Queensland, and I'm the program director of our newly formed Science of Learning Research Centre Learning Lab. And I head up our knowledge mobilisation or research translation work that we do in the Science of Learning. My background is actually in school education, and a lot of the work that I've done in knowledge mobilisation has been on how do we make sense of research for school-based educators. And then that moved into the higher education context and now is moving into an industry context. So I'm very much around that sort of research around knowledge mobilisation, knowledge brokering, research translation, particularly in relation to the science of learning. But I work with an amazing team of people from a range of different disciplines, and our group is headed up by Professor Anne-Marie Carroll, and she is the Associate Dean of Research here at the University of Queensland in the Haas faculty, with a very strong background in student and teacher wellbeing. And the Higher Education Learning Framework work was originally led by Associate Professor Jason Lodge. And there are other members of our team who are either still with us or who have moved on to other projects, but I just wanted to acknowledge that this work that I'm sharing tonight is not my work, but it is work of our team. So I'm going to start by providing you with an overview of what the science of learning is, just to ensure that we're all on the same page and understand what that field of research is about. Then I'm going to discuss very briefly how we can use the science of learning to inform our understanding, but also our valuing of wellbeing and engagement in the higher education learning context. Then I will introduce you to the higher education learning framework and how it was constructed before I introduce and explain the 7 principles of learning that have been produced through this framework and look at them through the lens of wellbeing and engagement in higher education. So the science of learning is a multidisciplinary field. So we have researchers who work from the very basic areas of research in neuroscience, looking at brain structure and function, through to those who work in cognitive psychology and educational research. But all of us are interested in questions about learning. And we recognise that learning can be reduced right down to those structural and functional components of the brain, right from the level of the synapse or the neuron. We recognise that learning can occur within an individual or study it at the individual level. But we also recognise that learning is a social and cultural process. And so we kind of use this catchphrase to, I guess, describe what we do, which is to understand learning from the synapse to society. We draw on this definition of the science of learning from Hayes, in that it is a multidisciplinary scientific inquiry into how people learn, the factors that affect learning, and the implications of that for teaching and learning design. And this is really where we start to see the intersection between learning, wellbeing, and engagement. Now, as you all would fully appreciate, learning is a highly complex phenomenon. And on the screen here, I've listed just some of the processes and the factors that are involved in learning. But there are many, many more, and we can study each of these right down to fine granular detail. And when we look at something like well-being, we also recognise its complexity. And here I've pulled together some of the key components of wellbeing drawn from the definitions of wellbeing that we've sort of engaged with in the work that we've done. So we recognise that wellbeing has hedonic elements in that it relates to experiencing at an individual level positive effect, pleasure and enjoyment. And they also have those eudaimonic elements in that individuals can experience meaning and purpose in life. So both learning and well-being are highly complex, and yet learning in the past and still in many contexts has been reduced down to very cognitive type processes. And Geraldine actually pointed this out just a moment ago, where she was talking about the disconnect between achievement and well-being. And we can see this even in the design of many of our learning environments, particularly in a university context, where we have this emphasis on a cognitive-oriented pedagogy, an emphasis on the transmission of knowledge from the teacher to the learner, and therefore an emphasis on cognitive skills such as memory and attention, of knowledge and skill acquisition. And this is also very much the case in school-based education as well. Likewise, both school and higher education have seen well-being as something that sits outside of the learning environment, that emotions and well-being are something that we don't want to play around with in the classroom. We just need to get down to the learning. So it's traditionally been perceived as something that's the responsibility of the individual and that shouldn't interfere with learning. But I think one of the most exciting aspects of the science of learning for me personally has been that it has really proven objectively on many, many levels what many of us as educators have known for a very long time, and that is that emotions are integral to and underpin a multitude of cognitive and behavioural functions that are essential to learning. Things like problem solving, attention, memory, risk-taking, all of these skills require emotional engagement. So a couple of overarching principles from the science of learning that can help us as we kind of grapple with how do we make sense of engaging learning and well-being in the higher education context could be to look at things like the fact that emotions do underpin cognition, that learning is both cognitive and emotional, and that learning is social, and that it is promoted through connection and engagement. And in fact, that being connected to what we're learning, how we're learning, and who we're learning from is absolutely fundamental to achievement. So our question here is, how can we support academics? And this is sort of the angle that we've come from with our higher education learning framework. We recognise that academics and teachers aren't trained as psychologists and counsellors, but how can we give them some tools and strategies to help them to understand, to value, and to integrate learning and well-being into the higher education context? And one of the ways that we have come up with that can help to frame this is through this higher education learning framework. And the group who drove the initial research that led to the development of this framework aimed to develop an evidence-informed framework for university learning. And we used a science of learning lens to shape this particular framework. Very briefly, the methodology that was used to come up with this particular framework and the 7 principles that I'm going to share with you are firstly a review of the existing literature into higher education, but also into the science of learning. They then interviewed 24 international experts in higher education learning, and then conducted a thematic analysis to arrive at a set of themes, which were then arranged into some principles. And those principles were then taken back to the 24 experts and to a stakeholder focus group, who then helped to refine those principles. Those principles were then developed into the framework. And then over the last few years, we've been implementing and evaluating the framework into the higher education context. So I want to share with you now the 7 themes and principles that have emerged through this process. The first theme that I'll introduce to you is an overarching theme, and these themes and principles are not in any kind of hierarchy, but this one I think is particularly important in the conversation we're having today around well-being, and that is that emotions play a role in how and why students learn. The second theme is around interactive learning, and the principle from that is that the social dynamics of learning can be leveraged to enhance the learning experience. The third theme is learning to learn, and the principle from that is that when students employ effective methods of thinking and when they understand how to learn, they can improve the way that they learn. The fourth theme is challenge and difficulty, and the principle from that is challenge and difficulty can be beneficial for student learning. The fifth theme is deep and meaningful learning, and the principle is that learning is built on prior knowledge and engages students in deep and meaningful thinking and feeling. The sixth theme is contextualized learning, and the principle is that learning occurs in context, and context can be leveraged to enhance the learning experience and learning outcomes. And the final theme is learning as becoming, and that converted into the very simply stated principle that learning is becoming. So I'm now going to unpack these 7 principles and illustrate how they are reflective of what we know about those fundamental, important constructs that underpin well-being as well as learning. So in terms of emotions and learning, we know from the science of learning that emotions are fundamental to both promoting or inhibiting learning for learners of all ages and across all contexts. We know that key cognitive functions are actually underpinned by and intertwined with emotions. So this principle is actually an overarching principle when we're considering the importance of learning and well-being. So if we want to promote learning and well-being, and as I said before, not all academics have training in mental health support. Not all academics come from a counselling or psychological background, but we need to provide all academics with the tools to be able to promote positive learning and positive well-being in their learning environments and their classrooms. So one way we can enact this particular principle is by modelling a range of positive emotional states and also trying to elicit positive emotional states in our students. And we can do that through designing learning experiences that promote interest, curiosity, creative thinking, wonder, and joy. We also need to be cognizant of trying to minimize any unnecessary stress, anxiety, fear, and shame that our students might experience, and recognize the impact of those negative emotional states that might be occurring because of things outside of the learning environment, but they can still be impacting on the learner's ability to attend and engage in a learning experience. The next principle around the social dynamics of learning. We know again from the science of learning that there are conscious and unconscious processes at play during social interactions. We also know that the quality of social interactions actually directly influences how engaged a learner is, and that engagement directly influences achievement through the quality of the learning environment. So as academics, we can be promoting learning and well-being by activating this particular principle through very simple strategies such as building familiarity across a group, by providing opportunities for students to interact, to have a discussion, to engage student voice. But we also need to be explicitly teaching social skills, things like cooperative learning, encouraging students to engage in socially shared regulation of learning, teaching questioning skills, engaging students in peer feedback. So opportunities for students to connect with one another, to identify similarities with one another, and to feel a sense of belonging in that social group. The next principle is around learning how to learn. And we know that learning can be optimized when students are taught, when they have the opportunity to apply, and when they can use strategies to effectively evaluate their learning. We need to better understand how to support our students to learn in multiple learning contexts. So not just in face-to-face environments, but in digital, in virtual, in workplace or laboratory environments as well. The evidence is very convincing in showing that when we build student competence in how they learn, it can actually enhance their confidence and their efficacy around their learning, and therefore reduce their anxiety, particularly as they're preparing for assessments. So as educators ourselves, we can promote learning and wellbeing through explicitly modelling, teaching, and allowing students to apply and evaluate effective learning strategies into their work. We can also be looking for ways to embed opportunities that promote self-regulation and socially shared regulated learning. And another way we can promote wellbeing and learning through this particular principle is by incorporating metacognitive tasks into assessments and encouraging students to be reflecting on what they know, what they don't know, and how they can be improving their learning. The next principle is around challenge and difficulty. And often in a higher education learning context, our students experience struggle and challenge. They might experience failure. These struggles and these challenges may lead to confusion, but confusion, which often leads to frustration, should actually be seen as a positive epistemic emotion. Because if we provide the correct sort of structures and scaffolds around that confusion, it can provide for students the opportunity to develop persistence and resilience and risk-taking. So it helps to build those positive dispositions for learning that can facilitate them beyond the classroom environment. So ways in which we can actually action this in our design of our learning experiences are to include experiences that are challenging, but that we allow scope for resolution and we allow time for resolution. That we design learning experiences that allow students to explore and to promote problem solving. And importantly, that we design into our teaching and learning experiences the opportunity for effective dialogic feedback, where students have the opportunity to clarify understanding, receive appropriate feedback and scaffolding, and understand where to go to next. Deep and meaningful learning refers to this idea that effective learning is highly active. It is not a passive process, and that we need to look for ways to connect new knowledge to prior knowledge and experiences. This can be very powerful as a way of promoting not just learning, but well-being for our students, because it can provide opportunities for our students to connect what they're doing in their learning experience with their life outside of the classroom, with their social and cultural contexts and prior experiences. And we can also do this by encouraging and valuing reflection and connection to individual contexts. And that leads on to the second last principle, which is around this idea of contextual learning. When we learn in context, what we're trying to do is to reflect or emulate real-world practice or problems. And that makes the learning experience more relevant, more meaningful, and more engaging for our students, and also enables greater transfer into the real-world environment. It also develops students' capacity to apply learning to novel and unfamiliar contexts, and this can reduce the anxiety that may be associated with that. So, as educators, we can promote learning and well-being by designing experiences that are reflective of real-world contexts, so by engaging students in problem-based learning or simulated learning tasks. Or we can provide opportunities for students to be placed into real-world environments and have the opportunity to practice those skills in the actual authentic context, such as going out on work placements or work integrated learning programs. And the final principle of learning is becoming. This principle is a really important one because it relates to the idea that a university experience transforms or can transform a person into a I guess, providing them with a new identity about who they can be and how they can contribute to the world. And we can do that by designing experiences that are holistic, embodied, and reflective, that are transformational and that contribute directly to the establishment of professional identity. But we need to encourage reflection, and we need to encourage our students to articulate their developing professional identity as they're working through their university degree. This process also allows them to articulate how they can purposefully and meaningfully contribute to the world beyond the life of their university studies. So if we think about these 7 principles and we think back to our definitions or our key constructs of well-being, these 7 principles address so many or all of these constructs that assist in promoting well-being in a learning environment. For us now, we are taking a step back from this because this research was conducted prior to COVID, and in reflection, we wonder whether these themes and principles actually capture as effectively the shift that we've seen into this digital and virtual and online environment that is so prevalent now in the higher education space. So we're now conducting a second version of the health and reaching out to international experts around the world to look at what principles are missing, what do we need to add, what do we need to revise to have a very strong set of principles that apply in both the face-to-face and traditional university environments, but also in the online and virtual space as well, and that support that learning and well-being. These 7 principles have recently been published in Times Higher Ed Campus, and if you would like to have a look there, you can find more information about those. But these resources are also openly available, and I'm very happy to share those with all of you today. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to your questions a little bit later on in the session.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for a very holistic and basic engaging presentation. Well organized and basically answering the questions set out at the beginning of this webinar. We will hear from all the people on the webinar a little bit later with their questions and their comments. And the webinar is also being recorded for people that may need to leave or not hear everything, and they could hear it later. So we will move on. Thank you. It is a very comprehensive framework, and a framework that could be used all over the world, I think. Thanks a lot. The next, basically the next presentation just basically follows in a different way of engaging students. Dr. Pilar Arabaruzabala, who is from the Autonomous University of Madrid, will talk about an international conversation. We'll talk about service learning as a strategy for promoting civic engagement in higher education. Dr. Zurabala, Pilar, please. Yes. It's great to have you here, and I know that colleagues from the network, the European Network on Service Learning, are also here. So we're very happy that you will be sharing the network's work and your work on service learning. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sophia, for inviting me. And it is a pleasure to participate in this webinar on learning, engagement, and belonging in higher education. And I think Dr. Mcmahon's presentation was a wonderful framework for this, for my presentation now on service learning. So if you allow me to share my screen. I don't know if you can see. Can you see my screen now?
No.
Yes.
Yes. We could see it. Perfect. Okay. Perfect.
And if I go to the next slide, you can see it too?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. So, as you said, Sophia, I work for the Autonomous University of Madrid in the Department of Pedagogy, in the School of Teacher Training and Education, and also at this moment I'm the president of the European Association of Service Learning in Higher Education. And if you allow me to create a framework for my presentation on service learning, I always start with the Sustainable Development Goals. You know that the United Nations are reminding all of us that the problem in our world are huge, are too many, and that governments by themselves will not be able to solve them. So they are asking everyone, every institution, every person to contribute. And of course, universities must contribute. And these problems that our world is facing are not just academic or research issues, but mostly civic engagement issues. And in that matter, in the university, we are not very used to, we are not very expert. So it's a challenge by itself. And also the European Union, through the Bologna Declaration, is also reminded us that universities have to contribute to the development of stable, peaceful, and democratic societies. Not just governments and international organizations are telling us to get involved and engaged, but also the higher education institutions through their mission statements are telling us that the university have a social responsibility. Universities have to engage, have to contribute to the common good. And in this case, I'm presenting the mission, part of the mission statement of my university, which says that, you know, it has to contribute to transfer knowledge to society, and is defined by its will to innovation and social involvement. Also, the strategic plans of the universities, and here you have the case of the University of Crete, remind us about this social mission, this social responsibility of the university. So this thing about, you know, our classical metaphor of the ivory tower, this has to stop. You know, it's not that we have the knowledge and others have to apply the knowledge for the well-being of humanity. No, this idea that civic engagement and college education are separate issues, this has to stop. It makes no sense anymore. On the other hand, this reciprocity is a term that describes the relationship much better, right? Because the university has a lot to give to the community. It has knowledge and it has resources, infrastructure, but the community has a lot to give to the university. In the community, the problems are real. And real problems require interdisciplinarity, and it requires collaborative work. And also the community gives the university the opportunity for students to apply the knowledge. So in social psychology, they say that when faced with human suffering, you know, in times of crisis, humans tend to react in different ways. One way is getting shocked. You don't know what to do, you are shocked. But another way is escaping. That's also very, very natural, very human. And there is another way, which is another reaction, which is acting. Act, do something about it. And that's what this methodology, service learning, proposes, to get involved, to act. But this methodology, service learning, is not just another methodology. You know, there are many ways in which we teachers can help our students, can facilitate learning to our students, but only a few of them share this quality. Only a few of them have a philosophy, a way of viewing the world, right? A way of understanding development as sustainable development, justice as social justice, not just legal justice, education and learning that is based on values, that is based on interdisciplinarity, that is student-centered, and a way of understanding citizenship, as citizens, as people who are involved, people who are acting, who contribute actively, that are critical, democratic, reflexive. So what is service learning? And I will present an example. If students in a chemistry class collect trash in a disadvantaged neighborhood, they are providing a service to the community, which probably will be volunteering. What they do is collecting water and waste and analyze it in the laboratory, and then they draw conclusions and write a report. They are doing a practical activity, and those two those two methods, right? Practical activities and volunteering and solidarity activities are very are necessary and very valuable, right? But when what the students do is picking up the garbage, analyzing what they have collected, sharing the results with the neighbors, providing them suggestions about how to recycle and reduce the bill, and they reflect on their experience, they reflect on their learning, and also on the effects that their service has provided to the community, then we are talking about service learning. Something that is very simple and not new at all is learning by providing a service to the community. It's very simple and at the same time very powerful, because we are talking here about contributing to the development of competent citizens, professional citizens that are capable of transforming society. So we are not talking about just developing professional skills, which is of course part of the university mission, but also that those students, when they graduate, they are committed to the others, right? They don't look to the side anymore. This is a definition of service learning, a little bit more developed, but it's essentially the same. Service learning is an experiential educational method, experiential because it's learning by doing, in which students engage in activities that address real human, social, and environmental needs from the social justice perspective. It's not just helping anyone, learning while helping anyone, but it's learning by helping those more in need. By integrating community service with the curriculum to enrich learning in any degree, to teach civic responsibility, and to improve communities through action. I said it's an experiential educational method, and through critical reflection. So that's what it is, and this is what it's not. It's not volunteering, because volunteering does not have to be embedded, integrated in the curriculum. It's not practicum, is not a curricular internship, because internships do not necessarily have this solidarity component. It's not a single-sided, there is a mutual benefit. It's not just academic, it's in formal and informal education. And it's not only for the young, for university students, it's for any age. And I would like to put some examples from different degrees, like in this case, students of agricultural engineering in the subject of horticultural farming, that they produce vegetables for meeting the needs of a community kitchen. In lights and action, students of mining and electrical engineering support students who were not able to complete compulsory secondary education, and they together provide advice on electrical supply in all apartment buildings where all people with low resources they live. And what they do is they supervise these electrical systems, and they provide assessment and advice on how to solve the problems, and in certain cases also they solve the problems. In the FIARE projects are still students from the School of Economics who become familiarized. They realize that throughout the career, throughout the studies, nobody ever taught them about ethical banking, so they decide to inform themselves and organize a campaign in the campus for the rest of the students. In chemical engineering, these students, what they do is help a city hall in a small village that is next to a river, and up in the river there is a mine, and the neighbors are always worried about the quality of the water. So what they do is they analyze daily the water. Connect our students from computing engineering, and they contribute to overcome the digital divide in a residence for the elderly. Adam's project is students from the medical and the nursing school who go to the hospital, to the oncology unit where children are hospitalized, and they just learn to communicate with the children in a different way, in a playful way. And the Right to Rights is our students from the law school who provide free support to people and social entities with low resources. Sleep and COVID-19, let's get our dreams back. Our psychology students who realized during the pandemic that many people were suffering from sleep problems, and they decided to get informed about it and also to develop some materials that would help people. And let me tell you a little bit more about service learning and the basic requirements of service learning projects. In any service learning project, there has to be service objectives based on a real need that is perceived as such, as a need, not just by the university, but also by the community, the entities, or the people with whom we work. And so there are service objectives, but also learning objectives that are connected to the curriculum, right? And another basic requirement is reflection, and this is key, is essential, is what really gives meaning to everything, is what makes the students make conscious about the effects that the project is having on themselves, but also on the others. And when I say on themselves, I mean not just on their learning, but also on their personal values and also on their social aspect, etc. So reflection, this systematic structure reflection is really essential. It's not just doing, but it's also reflecting on what we are doing and we are learning. And participation has two different connotations. One is participation means in service learning projects, the voice of the students is very important. So students have to make some decisions about the design, of course, the implementation, and also the evaluation. And also participation in a service learning project means that collaboration with partnership with other entities. So even if we can do the service with our own students, we don't need anyone anymore for example, cleaning a river from spices that are not, what's the word, that are invading, right? We can do that with our students. We organize it, we have all the learning that we need and all the knowledge that we need, but still, if we want it to be called service learning, we have to at least ask ourselves with who else we can collaborate. It can be an NGO that is devoted to environmental issues, or it can be another school, or it can be the government or the local government or a neighbors association or whatever. But partnership in service learning projects is very important. I said that reflection was a key element, and there are so many issues that we can reflect about with our students and with the entities that we work with, but we have to select, right? The reflection is going to be systematic, but I mean, it is already predefined when we are going to reflect about what issues and how and who. But we have to select very well, because there are so many issues that we can reflect about. And there are many other quality standards of service learning, but we don't have time to talk about all of them now. But it's important to say that service learning has to have credit recognition This is not a complement, the message for the students. This is not complementary. This is not just for the most sensitive and motivated ones. This is for everybody, and it's recognized with credits, right? We can, the type of services can be very wide. Unfortunately, there are too many problems. Actions to be developed in a service learning project. It doesn't matter what subject is linked to. It doesn't matter what the service is. All service learning projects, in all service learning projects, in anyone, all these actions take place. Students have to do research because they have to investigate about the community and the situation and the challenge, the problem that they are facing, even if they are copying a project, even if they are repeating a project, still they have to do research about how this community arrived to this situation. Of course, they have to plan, act, reflect. Also, students do not only act and learn, but they also have to, act and learn, they have to actively learn, but they have to also demonstrate the learning that they did and the service that they provided, right? So dissemination is very important. When the students disseminate, they become more conscious about their learning and the effect this project has had on them and on the society. And also they are putting the focus on a challenge, on a problem, right? And they are like a speaker that, hey, this is a problem, we all have to be involved. So this activity, this action of demonstrating and disseminating what they have learned, which can be done in many different ways, maybe provide just developing a video and putting it, upload it in YouTube, or they can go to a conference with a paper, they can, dissemination can take many different forms. Evaluation, of course, the projects have to be evaluated. And also this is very specific of service learning, which is celebration, right? We are celebrating that we are together, learning together and providing a service together. We will not have time today to get into how to design a service learning course, but this is something that has to be checked before we get into using this methodology. And I would like to say a couple of words about the effects of this methodology on the students. And we know by meta-studies that it has positive effects on all these areas, which are almost all developmental areas, except for physical education and also physical education. Some service learning projects focus specifically on that, but we're talking about just by the fact of being service learning, a project has a positive effect on academic and cognitive, civic, vocational and professional, ethical and moral, personal and social. And I included this, it has too much text, I'm sorry, but because this webinar is on mental health of students, I thought that it would be interesting to review very quickly the benefits of service learning projects for students' mental health, because it has a positive effect on motivation, flexibility, interculturality, tolerance, self-confidence, civic commitment, relationships, satisfaction, recognition. Students is a students base and reciprocity. And it has also positive effect on teachers and on the universities themselves, but also, of course, in the community. In any service learning project, it doesn't matter what services or to what subject is linked. We develop almost all the transversal competencies that any student, any graduate student should have at the end of their bachelor degree. And let me finish. Let me complete just quickly a panorama of service learning in higher education in the world. And this is not exhaustive, please don't think this is just an example to show you that service learning is all around the world, and that the last region to use service learning was Europe. And fortunately, that started to change in 2014 with a European project called Europe Engaged that mapped what was happening in higher education with service learning. But then, you know, in 2019, the European Association of Service Learning in Higher Education was created, and the observatory, the European Observatory of Service Learning in Higher Education, is linked to the association, and there are annual conferences, and the observatory has identified service learning activities in at least 29 European countries and is collecting experiences all over. There are national networks, not in all countries, but more and more countries are, teachers and are becoming together. And finally, I think it's important to say that this methodology needs the help of the institutions and the governments, and it needs to be institutionalized little by little, right? So thank you very much. A last reflection, all these, why are we talking about all these issues today in the webinar, and I think it's important to go back to the beginning, to the essential, what is the ultimate goal of education? And here we are clear that the ultimate goal of education is none other than the sake of humanity. So thank you very much. I stop sharing and I'm available for your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Pilar. Provided us not only with the I don't know if you hear me. Hello? Yes. Okay, great. The presentation not only provided us with what is service learning, and it gave us examples of how and where it could be applied, and also brought it to the level of understanding education in I would say a broader light than just what a degree or a profession, but as part of being part of a community and basically serving the world. So thank you very, very much. We will open up now the conversation to everybody. I know that there's some questions. I know that there were some in the chat. So I encourage the colleagues that have posed questions in the chat to pose the questions to either Pilar or Stephanie, and we will engage in a conversation and see how these two very holistic, comprehensive, and I would say for most places, innovative ways of engaging students in higher education and in helping not only with their learning and their achievement and their professional development, but with their emotional and development and their ability to interact with others and see a broader place of themselves and belong in a world, not only in one community. So please, questions. I know that Dr. Ikonomu had some questions in the chat. He could pose them, and then please, everybody, the questions that you have from our two very distinguished speakers, please pose the questions and let's start the conversation.
I don't know.
You want to just read the questions, Sophia, or?
No, I think you could pose them. We could pose the question. Yeah, you're the only one I think that had some questions in the chat. So go ahead.
Oh, okay. So just for both speakers, and thank you very much. These were delightful talks, both of them. I was really taken away. So for Dr. Mcmahon, the question concerns basically this creation of an immersive environment for students that have like different levels of education maybe, or different cultural backgrounds, and how do we deal with this problem? So that's the essence of that question. And then for Dr. Araburuzala, I'm sorry, I'm massacring your name as well. Service learning, we've been struggling in our department. For example, we have this traditional practicum in the psychology department, and we'd like to go to like alternative ways of giving our students some practical training. So could you say a few more words on how soon do you think students can be engaged in such programs? What's a good duration for a program like that to be effective? And also, are there any downsides, especially at the vocational and professional level, with respect to traditional practicums that we're using so far? And again, thank you very much, both of you. That was delightful.
Stephanie, if you want to go first.
Yes, I'm happy to go first. And thank you very much for that question. Is it Elias Economo? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's much better than the pronunciation I did on Pilar's name.
Well, and just call me Steph. It's much easier. I'm quite happy with Steph. I think that if I understand your question correctly, you're asking about how different students might react in an immersive kind of interactive kind of environment. Is that what you're getting at?
Especially on that third principle about challenges. So and levels of difficulty. So
yeah, okay. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, the overarching thing to remember with all of these principles is that we have to consider them in light of the individual differences of the learners in front of us. And, you know, I guess another overarching principle of the science of learning is every learner is unique. And that poses us both problems and possibilities as educators, I think, because it means that if we've got a very large cohort, it can be very difficult to apply a one-size-fits-all kind of principle approach to the design of our teaching and learning experiences. But I think what it does provide for us is an opportunity to think of different ways to engage those individual differences, those different experiences, those different backgrounds, by you know, perhaps looking at ways to get students to work in small familiar groups with others who they feel a sense of connection and belonging with, as opposed to getting them to connect on a larger scale with a whole cohort, for example. So I think you know, underpinning all of this is that importance of our understanding that there are individual differences, there are very different learning experiences, there are very different cultural experiences. I mean, I teach a lot of international students, a lot from China and Southeast Asia, and their experience of collaboration when we're working in a class and of asking questions and having open discussions is quite different to what they would have, what they've experienced at home. And we have conversations about that. And I set up the classroom environment in such a way that I make it clear that this is a protocol that we will engage in the class when they feel safe and ready to do so. So I will encourage them to speak firstly to the person next to them, as opposed to raising their hand and asking me a question. Or I will suggest to them that they engage in a Padlet and put their questions up anonymously, as opposed to raising their hand and asking me a question. So establishing that sense of, I guess, shared respect of differences and how those differences might be influencing the way that I might be leading that instructional session and the way that they might be engaging with that. So I think there's a lot of learning on behalf of us in terms of understanding our students and understanding what they bring to that learning experience. and respecting that diversity, recognizing that we'll probably get some things wrong as we're trying to engage with students who are so diverse in their cultural and cognitive backgrounds. But establishing an environment where they feel safe enough to, I guess, adopt some of those principles as we move through the course of the semester. But I think my overarching message to you is recognizing that there are individual differences, and looking for ways to accommodate those as best as possible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and we're especially concerned with the growing number of students that we have in classrooms, and that makes what you're talking about much more difficult to do in like a large auditorium. There.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why we do also want to look at additional principles around how can we be engaging with digital platforms that might make those challenges a little bit more amenable. Yeah, you know, there's still a lot of questions that are unanswered, and I think someone mentioned earlier the importance of context. And, you know, I'm very fortunate that the classes I teach, the biggest class I teach is probably about 85 students, whereas in psychology, they're teaching 3,000 or 4,000 in a room. So it's, you know, they're very, very different contexts. And we also need to respect and value the professional expertise of the educators working with those students, and their knowledge of what works with that particular cohort as well. I'll throw to Pilar to answer your question.
Thank you. Yes, well, Elias made specific questions like how soon can students be engaged in service learning? As soon as they enter the university, first year. Actually, service learning is not just for last year students, or there are service learning projects in preschool. So that means that age is not, and the benefits of service learning for first year students are wonderful, because when they enter, they think they have a vocation, but they don't have the opportunity to prove it, you know, to go to the real world and see if they have the abilities, if they really like it. So for first year students, it's especially beneficial, because it provides extra benefits like those ones, right? Like say, okay, yes, I have been confronted with problems, and I saw that I had the ability to solve them, and you know, I really like the studies that I chose, and they don't have to wait until third or fourth year to go to the real world to do the practicum. They have the opportunity to go to the real life in the first year. So the answer is any. I mean, not everything has to be service learning, and certainly not all the subjects have to include service learning. But we always say that at least once throughout the studies, the students have to have the opportunity to experience this methodology, because we know by research, you know, that once you participate in a service learning project, you develop a commitment that lasts forever. So you will probably, after you graduate, you will probably be more engaged, you know, even by your own or working with an NGO or with another social entity. But so that's, I think, the question to the answer to how soon can students be engaged, and then how do we integrate it in the curriculum? Okay, I have been, because we don't have much time, I could not get in detail into that. I was talking all the time about integrating it in subjects, in curriculum, in the curricular subjects, in the matters, right, in the formal curriculum. That's one thing. So is put it into the syllabus, right? Is really integrating it, acknowledging with ECTS. Of course, if a subject has 12 ECTS, and one of the methodologies you use is service learning. Participating in a service learning project will have part of those 12 credits, right? Just as an example. Anyway, so when it's integrated in a subject, the credit recognition is given for granted. But it can be linked not just to specific subjects, but also it can be a specific course. You know, for example, in my university, we have courses that are free credits, you know, we say optional credits, right? Sometimes those courses are specific for a study, for example, mechanical engineering, but sometimes are open for the whole university, any student from any degree. That's very good too, working with a student from other degrees and even from other universities and better from other countries. But anyway, what I'm saying is that not necessarily those specific service learning courses have to be linked to specific degrees, but they can be linked to transversal competencies. So there are service objectives and learning objectives that are transversal generic competencies, right? So I don't know if with that I solve at least partially that question. And then he says, what's an ideal duration of such a program? There is no ideal. It depends on so many things. It depends on, is this a semester, a subject that lasts a semester, or is a whole year? And then, you know, how much time within your class you can devote to this methodology and the contents that are used in this methodology, because in a subject you have many other contents, many other, you know, methodologies. So we have to be realistic, and here there are no rules, you know, you see what you have and then you decide how long and how big your project can be, right? And it will also depend on the number of students. For a large number of students, you have to decide what kind of service you can provide. There are services that can be applied, it can be given by many students. Others, you know, you need one or two. So there are many variables, right? This is not just a fixed service learning, is not a fixed thing. But there are some fixed principles, you know, things to take care about, and then you have to adapt to your variables, to your situation, to your availability. To if this is the first time you do a service learning project, don't use a big project. Start with a little one. Offer it to a few students, right? It can be volunteer. It can be mandatory. If you do mandatory, you really have to be well prepared, you know, and trained and experienced. The nature of this methodology says, okay, if a student's voice is important, mandatory does not fit well, right? It's not like too coherent. But on the other hand, if we make it volunteer, who will volunteer for a service learning project? The students who need it the least. The students who are already committed, who are sensitive. So sometimes, you know, since we are in an educational institution, it's justified that we make it mandatory. If we want to make it mandatory, it's justified, because then we make sure that all the students will have the opportunity to at least try it. And for that reason, it's good that institutionalization, that service learning is institutionalized, when we have support from the institution, so it is organized, and the institution can make sure that in the plan, in the studies, at least once the students have the opportunity to do it, you know. Anyway, I don't want to talk more. There are more questions, but I want to give others the opportunity to talk.
Thank you, Pilar. I think there are a couple of questions. I think Dr. Yavazulia, I saw he had raised his hand. He has a couple of questions also.
Yes, thanks, Sophia. Yeah, thank you both. Actually, your talks were really insightful and very much connected to the Embrace's aims and content. to our project. First, I would like to ask Steph a question. I think she kind of I think answered when she was answering Elias's question, but coming from a counseling background, I think it's quite important. So I would like to pinpoint it a little bit more. I mean, you did mention that the learning is, of course, is been affected from a wide range of factors, which is really true. But also learning is a dyadic and interactive process that involves, among other, two basic parts, the educator and the students. So I would really be interested in whether you have research, you've done some research, or what do you think about the necessary characteristics or skills that the educators should possess or cultivate in order to be able to, provide, promote learning and well-being experiences to students, like, for example, avoid stress, avoid criticism, allow reflection from the part of the students, allow exploration. I mean, what do educators themselves need to have as persons? What kind of skills or characteristics in order to be able to offer such experiences to their students? And then I want to ask something, Pilar. Yeah.
Lovely. What a great question. And I think if we could answer that really neatly, we'd have that's the $1 million question, isn't it, about teaching and learning? But it does somewhat align with what I actually did for my PhD, which was looking at, my background is from school, working in schools as a middle leader. And I was actually a music teacher, an arts and music teacher, head of an arts faculty. And I was really fascinated how you could walk into one teacher's classroom and get a really strong sense that the students are very engaged, they're very on task, they're creating, they're connected. You could walk into another teacher's classroom and you'd get a very different sense. And I wanted to know what was going on, and was it possible to teach teachers a capacity to create that vibe, that's what I ended up calling it, was this vibe in the classroom, which was this sense of engagement or being connected to one another and to the learning experience. And through my research, what I found was that a connected classroom, if we understand what a connected classroom environment is, then teachers can engineer that. So then I guess we can shape our behaviours and our planning to facilitate that. And I found that there were sort of 4 key domains. One was creating a sense of familiarity. So establishing an understanding of one another, breaking down any cliques that might exist, whether they be social or cultural or gender or academic, regardless of whether this is a year 1 classroom or a higher education classroom. The second one was affect. So understanding the impact of positive emotional states and negative emotional states, but not discarding the power of some negative emotions. So things like confusion can feel negative, but it can be a really powerful learning tool. Anxiety or coming from a performing arts background, being nervous can be a very positive thing, but it feels quite negative, but understanding those emotional states. So understanding how to use emotions effectively in the classroom, our role in modeling positive emotional states, even when we feel miserable, still behaving as if we're feeling on top of the world and feeling like we've got lots of energy because of the power of emotional contagion in a group. Likewise, the power of behavioural contagion. So if we're slumped or if we're looking tired, that immediately has an impact on our students as well. So familiarity, affect. The third domain was competence, that students like to know that we are competent in helping them learn, but they also want to know that we are competent in helping their peers to learn. And I found that a really fascinating one. I wasn't surprised by the fact that they would want us to be good at our job, but I was very interested in this finding that students are actually very concerned about whether or not you're going to help everybody. They sort of identify as a collective group and they want you to be able to help all of them. So favoritism within a class was frowned upon by the participants in my study, which I found very interesting. And the fourth one was providing opportunities for student voice and choice. So opening up for questions and conversations and creating small groups, or using different ways to capture student voice, whether it be writing on post-it notes or on digital platforms. So I think rather than identifying personality characteristics of individual teachers, I think it's because I think the other thing is students know when you're being authentic and when you're not being authentic. So how I might behave in a classroom might be very different to someone else, but students might still be connected to both of us. So I think it's really important to be authentic, but to understand what are those characteristics that make a connected learning environment, and then engineering or designing your teaching and learning experiences that facilitate that seems to be, quite a powerful way to achieve that connection that you need between your students and teachers.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, yeah, it's very clear. I think I would also expect that, the capacity for, emotional self-reflection or self-awareness from the part of the educators would play also a role, because, from my experience, I think, it actually affects even the way I perceive a specific question, the way I feel in the classroom. I mean, emotions are not, on the part of the students, but only for our part. So I sense very often that, how I feel may, affect the way I perceive a specific question in a specific class, and that would, have an impact on the whole learning, process afterwards. So
I think, yeah, that's absolutely fundamental. And I overlooked mentioning that when I've just found these four kind of domains in my work, what I've actually done is put them into a matrix that is a self-regulated learning framework for teachers, so that it promotes self-reflection and adaptive metacognition. And so it is very much, you're constantly engaging with this. How am I interpreting this interaction I'm having with this particular student? How am I interpreting the body language of that particular student? Am I perhaps being clouded by my biases or my assumptions about what that student is bringing to the learning experience today? So absolutely, being metacognitive and being highly reflective and being regulated in the way that you're going about that teaching and learning experience is absolutely essential.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And a question for Pilar. I don't dare to pronounce the surname, sorry. So service learning, I mean, activities seem really important, in the whole educational process. I was wondering, what's your opinion about, how the intensification of studies, especially in the tertiary university level, the intensification of the work demands the students are faced with, how this reality, I mean, in Greece, we noticed that very much in the curricula, how this might impede the opportunities for, integrating such activities in the curriculum.
I'm not sure if I understood. Can you please repeat the question?
Yeah, I was wondering how the intensification of studies, the fact that students have to fulfill, many tasks, cognitive oriented, as Stephanie was mentioning before, essays, exams, the workload of students seem to be sometimes overwhelming. And with that fact, how we can also add, or I don't know, replace the service learning activities, which would demand time from the part of the students, in order to be involved in, community, work or such things.
Yeah, I understand. Yes, how can we identify if this is if we have the conditions to use service learning, right? In terms of time and or the number of students or the number of activities to be developed, right? Well, first of all, as I said, not every class has to use service learning. It can be used in almost every subject in every study. But then we have to deal with other variables, as I said before. So if we ask ourselves, can we try this year? Can we use service learning? And if the answer is, well, let's try. Let me at least think about it, and you analyze your conditions and you realize that, well, yes, we can try maybe with a small project, with a small number of students, with some social entity that I know already. And if you decide yes, in spite of all the elements and conditions and variables that difficulties, I can still try to implement a project. Then go ahead, start with something small. But you may also decide, no, it's too much, it will take too much time, I don't have it, I don't feel competent, well, there are many things that can be done. For example, if your university or outside of your university, you see a service learning course, go and take it, because it might give you ideas. Other teachers went through the same and asked themselves the same questions. And it's easier if you do it knowing that there are others that are supporting you, that you can, ask for assessment, and also check in the web. There are, or with your national networks, there are many projects already designed that can give you an idea, or you can jump or join a project. There are tools that make your life easier, because you don't have to develop a rubric, you don't have to develop initial reflection, a question or whatever. So that will also help. If you really want to try, there are ways of trying, working small and in collaboration and using others' experience, etc. But you may decide, no, I cannot do it, right? Now, talking in general, university are too many teachers try to teach too many things. And we know what happens, that at the end, I was a master on getting good grades, and when I left the exam, I remember nothing, right? So who wants that?
This is where I was getting at, exactly.
Less content. You as an expert know what is basic, and they have to know, remember, when they start working. And if you reduce the amount of contents with what is essential, and then you make sure that those students will remember, that's significant learning, because they have to apply the knowledge. They are going to remember that knowledge for good, right? So that's a balance also, maybe less content and more significant learning.
Thank you very much. This is
Thank you very
very
much.
important.
That's a great comment, Pilar, indeed, because I think that most of us in academia were masters at getting high grades, yes, and we sometimes have the tendency to repeat the way we were taught, the way we learned, and think that our students are going to follow track. Unfortunately, from what we read in the literature and from what our reality is, students today, and not all students are going to be, teachers at the university. And students today learning very different ways. And we have a wider student body. And most universities, especially the public universities, and we need to take into account all these variables that say that we basically individualize how as much as possible. And individualizing means indeed going to the community and indeed doing practical things. So thank you very much for that. It kind of makes us reflect on our own teaching and learning. Yes. I think that there might be another question. I think Dr. Dimitropoulou had a question.
Thank you. Yes, yes, just a little bit. I was really interested on that part. Thank you very much, both Steph and Pilar. I'm not saying the surnames again, both of you. My name is Yota, don't pronounce it all of it. It's a long also name. I was really wondering, it's for Steph, the question, the digital environment, that is really intriguing, especially regarding the emotions of students and the emotion of teachers also. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about this kind of project, because I suppose it is a continuum with what you have already done to your model. And especially regarding the dimension emotions, it's really difficult to search on that. How would you approach such this dimension of the model? Just to say a little bit more if you could. Yeah,
I did see your question before in the chat around, how do we capture emotions in a digital learning environment? And that it's very, very difficult. And I think, that's been a challenge in research for a long time, is how do we actually capture emotions even in a face-to-face learning environment? And one way in which we can get some, I guess, some correlates of emotion through physiological measurements. So we have a team who do use biometric wristbands and heart rate monitors. So we can use those to establish some physiological correlations between an event and potentially like a level of arousal or engagement or an emotional response. So the physiological wrist or the biometric wristbands actually measure sweat response or skin conductance, and that gives you an indication of arousal level. So we can use that to try to identify, are there particular points in a lesson where arousal is high or low? So there is scope for the use of those in studies with students working in a digital space. The other, I guess, more traditional methods are self-report, but we're not particularly good at self-reporting our own emotional states. A colleague of mine actually developed an app that she then had students use in a high school context, where they had to, at any point in their lesson, they could indicate what emotion they were feeling and what was triggering that emotion. So there are digital platforms that we're developing that can assist with that. But again, that relies on that self-report. There are also experience sampling methods where we can text a short survey to a group of participants who are working, and they can respond to that. But there are, I guess, trying to have a combination of measures that can give us as objective an indication of emotional states as we possibly can. There are also observational measures. There are eye tracking devices that we can use if we've got students sitting in front of computers within our laboratory testing. We do have MRI, so we can do that, but that's just very removed from a real learning environment. So there are, and there are also cognitive kind of tests. I'm not an expert in this area at all, but I know that there are tests that can be used to give an indication of emotion regulation or attention during digital learning environments as well. So it will be a combination of different things that we will be looking at, but it is still, quite a challenging, I guess, concept to measure in that digital space, but we're giving it a go.
Thank you. I was just thinking about academic emotions, all the theory about Beckman's academic emotions, how they arise in the environment. That's why I try to figure out how you're going to use it. And just thank you very much, Stefan. For Dr. Pilar, also just a question. I was thinking about students having a different cultural background on service learning. and how this background might affect their engagement in service learning. You know, students coming from other societies where helping and showing gratitude and things like that are more common from students being more solid, you know, not solid, sorry, more on themselves in learning. So I was thinking the cultural background, how it affects actually their engagement in service learning. Do you have any aspect or opinion on that?
Well, actually, service learning favors and promotes differences and diversity. And for participating in a service learning project, for contributing to facing and trying to solve a problem in the community, you need you need diversity. You need all kind of competencies, capacities, interests, motivations, attitudes. You need diversity, really, and also diversity in culture. Actually, service learning promotes the development of acceptance of cultural diversity, but also it requires cultural diversity and diversity in everything. Let's just put an example. We said that all projects have to be disseminated, right? And many times it's quite common because it's very motivating for the students to develop a short video and upload it in YouTube, 3-5 minutes video speaking about their experience. And for doing that, the students need all kind of competencies and all kind of abilities. And we require diversity for that, because we need people who are very good at digital things and technical things, but we also need people who are artistic. We need people who know very well how to collapse, synthesize information, select information, writing it, putting it in a nice way, and then we need people who put the music, and then even the el guion. How do you say I can say the word, but you need to know what the video will select all the information and right. So all that requires diversity. Diversity is welcome and diversity is promoted, right? And because not always, but very often the service is provided to cultures and contexts that are different to the ones of the students, right? That requires getting closer, knowing about that culture, valuing, analyzing your prejudices, analyzing your expectations, your motivations, because reflection is very important, as I said. So that contributes also to value cultural diversity, right?
We have a question from Dr. Matopoulos, I think.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for all the speakers and for this wonderful project, because it's very intriguing and the time is just right, I think, for this. I have 2 questions. One is for all the speakers, if they can comment on a comment, and I have one question for Stephanie from Australia. The first has to do with the valorization more of the findings. I saw the first couple of slides talking about the well-being toolbox component, which is amazing and very useful. Now, my comment, and please comment on that, is that this is a great tool, but what I would wonder, and I want your comment on, is the cultural component. What I mean is this toolbox is a generic toolbox, we have to keep in mind the cultural component. For example, what well-being means in Greece is totally different from well-being in Australia, from Spain, from Serbia, from other countries. So therefore, the cultural concept of well-being for our students in universities are quite different. So therefore, we need to be thinking how we can take the toolbox and adjust it to the culture. One point is that. The second, which I really like, and I want to emphasize a bit, you had it in the slide, has to do with policy making. You have it right. I think Geraldine in the very beginning talked about that, about the policy making. I believe this is really important. And after a project like that finishes, I think the next component, in my opinion, I may be wrong, is to get the policymakers to look at that and write policy on that. So that's one thing. And the second question that has to do with the presentation, Stephanie's presentation about the 7 principles, which I found extremely well put. For example, again, I take from my first point the cultural component. All these 7 principles are right on the money and is very useful, but again, they're really important to see how we can see a fit. I think there is somebody, the mic on. How we can see these principles be applied in our cultures. I'll give you an example from the Greek culture. Your third principle about metacognitive skills, and your very last, which I found the most important, learning is becoming. In the Greek context of higher education, we have a significant problem because the educational system is structured as such to talk about memorization. So all students go into memorization. Who talks about metacognition? Who talks about reflection and unbecoming? So in Greece, I would assume there are other countries as well, we have this tremendous difficulty to move the norms from memorization and a lot of content, as Pilar was saying, to just reflection and metacognitive skills. So how do we go about doing that? Because here's another component that has to do with our culture. Thank you.
Do you want me to answer that one first and then go back to your other question, which I think Geraldine will probably answer that one. And you're totally right. I mean, it's all very well to have principles of learning, and this is part of what I do as in my work in knowledge mobilization, working in schools. I work with a lot of schools across Australia and with a lot of different industries. And you can't just take research and put it into someone's context. You can't just go, here are some principles, everyone should be doing this. What we do is we go into context first. So we go into individual schools and we get to know what is their problem of practice or what is their focus of inquiry that they're interested in. And then we work with that to look at, well, what research can support an understanding of that in your context. And then how do we conduct our own research in that context to investigate what this might look like. And I think it's the same whether it's a primary school or whether it's a higher education context or whether you're working with an industry partner. It's about getting to know that context, getting to know the system that sits around that context. Someone mentioned earlier about, I think it was Geraldine talking about, you know, when we're talking about well-being, we have to acknowledge the system within which each of these problems are situated, because we can't just isolate individual students because those students belong to a cohort, who belong to a faculty, who belong to a socio-cultural context, who belong to a political environment. And all of those things play into how these principles can then be applied. So I think the principles can be a starting point. They can give you a springboard for a conversation about what effective learning practices might look like, but they're not the be-all and end-all. The be-all and end-all are the people on the ground who understand the context. And certainly the conversations around the importance of memorization or a learning environment focused on knowledge acquisition and memory are conversations we've had with others. And it's about giving them tools to perhaps shift those conversations with those important people who can be part of that conversation, who may have an influence over that. And our approach tends to be start quite small and get a ripple effect happening, as opposed to a top-down, everyone throw out what you're doing and just everybody do this. It's definitely about having that dialogue, understanding context, looking for where the priorities might be. And like you say, that learning is such a powerful principle, but it's probably not a good place to start because it's so big. So there might be something else that might align with something that is already happening in that context that could start a conversation about how are we using evidence to inform our practice that can improve learning and well-being for our students. And that might then open the doors for further conversations about other ways that we might be thinking differently about the way that we're doing teaching and learning. So for me, context is absolutely the most important thing to get to know before you try and implement or change anything. Does that help answer that question?
Fantastic, absolutely. I guess context is different within even Australia. Can you imagine the rest of the world? So thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense to me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I could try to answer your first question also regarding the differences in understanding the concept of well-being. Yes, you are absolutely right. And how does it, what does it have to do with survey learning projects? Well, yes, the first thing is to acknowledge that well-being is a very contextual and even subjective issue, but there are also some objective definitions of what is and what is not. And for example, if we are in doubt of what it means and what definition it has for us, we can always go to the ODS number 3 that defines what is, it has to do with good health and well-being. But if that is an important issue for implementing our project, I would say we have different options. One is what I said, to go to definitions that already exist, but the other is define your own definition with your students and your community entities, your operative definition, what is for you, your students, and the final beneficiaries of the service, what is well-being, Also, you can develop a project for working on that, for defining, your survey learning project. If it fits into your subject, it can be defining what well-being is for the people in your community, in your culture. Those are 3 ideas. I don't know if that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Although we may have very different cultures and very different contexts, we touched upon the idea of community and communities of practice. I think in order to implement either the framework that Stephanie so nicely described, or to apply service learning initiatives, we have to be ready in our departments and our universities and our communities to reflect upon what is important, what should be focused on, to come up with our own ideas of how we turn our curriculum into a more engaging curriculum, and how we turn our curriculum into what is considered civically important and essential. and needs to be done at the moment to answer the problems that we're surrounded by. Basically, today, I think that today's webinar was the start of a conversation across the globe in a way, but I would really I have to say that I'm so enthusiastic and so pleased with the results today that I hope that we can continue at some other point, definitely to see how two very different frameworks, they're very different and they come from a very different scientific background. One is more practical community engagement, and the other has to do with more academic emphasis, but they come together. And I think that that's the important part of understanding what's going on in higher education today and what has to be done. What we have to do is basically put together what our world needs right now and what the students that we have to confront when they go out and they have this degree or whatever the degree is. And in order to, they cannot be away from the world for the 4 years or how many years it takes to get an education. And also our ivory towers cannot be ivory towers anymore. They have to be basically so flexible that they are just part of the world and not just a tower that some people cannot enter and that some people have very little contact with. So we will try to see how, at least from our part here at the University of Crete and from the Embrace Project, how we could come together again and discuss these issues. It seemed we've even gone past time. I know, for instance, for myself and the department here of psychology, we've been talking about the service learning for a long time. But we will think about how we could join the network and learn. And we would also like to learn from our Australian colleagues so far away, because these both frameworks are very relevant to all of us. So we really thank you very, very, very much. We appreciate your contributions, and we hope that this contributes to what's going on in Europe and elsewhere in higher education in some ways. So thank you very, very, very much. And I really almost feel like not closing the session, but we have to close because our time is up. And we have getting very positive comments from all the colleagues who and people that were following the webinar today. So we will keep in touch. I'll make sure of that, and we will see how we could continue this conversation and even widen the circle. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, Sophia.
Thank you.
You're very well. It's our appreciation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.